Hi, everyone, and welcome to this recording of The Machine from the Great Cosmic Mother by Monica Siju and Barbara Moore. And I think that The Machine is probably one of the most important and long chapters in the Great Cosmic Mother because it really distills a lot of aspects around reproductive experience and the ways in which it has been co-opted throughout societies. And I'd really like to dig into this chapter more in depth, also as a conversation piece, for us really to have a framework to discuss abortion and reproductive experience through the lens of the Great Cosmic Mother. So without further ado, The Machine. Three connected phenomena are happening all around us in the very modern world of the 1980s. They are, number one, the rise of power of fundamentalist sects, Christian, Judaic, Islamic, Hindu, Buddhist, Confucian, and their collusion with business and military-dominated governments in directing theological and political attacks at women's rights, in particular, women's rights to control our reproductive capacities, and two, the growth and global distribution of reproductive technologies from birth control pills, IUDs, and coercive sterilization programs dumped on third world women, to the expensive and complex Western technologies of making sterile women pregnant through the transplantation of unfertilized eggs and embryos from the ovaries and wombs of egg mothers to the wombs of host mothers, and their correlative genetic engineering of embryos to make babies to order, and three, of the American corporate structures and advanced production technologies into global factories, where virtually trapped workers, over 80% of them women, work and often live behind the barbed wire walls of free trade zones at subsistence level wages, controlled in both work and private life by a corporate government collusion that forbids them union organization or political protest and often extends to the economic control of their reproductive lives. Multinational corporations give preferential employment to single women without children and with no plans to have children. And in India's textile industry, employers prefer women who've been sterilized through the government's population control program. And in the Bataan export processing zone in the Philippines, the Mattel company offers prizes to women workers making toys and Barbie dolls who undergo sterilization. These three trends might seem disconnected and even sometimes publicly antagonistic, but in truth, they are all profoundly linked. Their linkage can be traced to the Bronze Age, to the practical beginnings of patriarchy at the end of the Neolithic, when men first began to organize to gain systematic control over, number one, women's production, and number two, women's production, and two, women's reproduction. And we've said the definition of the female body under patriarchy corresponds to the definition of the worker's body under the private capitalist American or state capitalist Soviet production systems. At the beginning of Bronze Age patriarchy, males began to take over women's ancient inventions and improving them, capitalizing them by turning rhythmic, local, qualitative handicraft work into quantitative, mechanized mass production for trade in the building of wealth. Simultaneously, patriarchal men moved to take over and improve, capitalize, the most primal production of all, the female's production of children, modeling their religious and practical notions on their new experience of cattle breeding. Men redefined the ontologically and autonomously creative female body into a machine for producing wealth. That is, wealth for men via the patriarchal family in the form of children as inheritors of patrilineal controlled property, and children who could be used to make more wealth as workers or traded for wealth in the form of female bodies traded as wives. Patriarchal religion grew side by side with patriarchal wealth and secular power. The father gods' male priesthoods rationalized and sacralized the pastoralistic control and use of women's bodies as wealth breeding machines, and simultaneously with cattle breeding, spiritually programming generations of both men and women to believe that God was now a male and wanted it this way. The Neolithic goddess religions that had supported female sexual autonomy, female control over both sexual pleasure and reproduction, was religiously demonized and politically destroyed. With the growth and elaboration of the tribes into nation empires, structural systematic control of female reproduction passed from the private hands of fathers and husbands and into the functional machinery of state political economies. Mailer rulers attempted, at least, to regulate populations according to state and business fluctuations, the need for increase or decrease in labor or armies, for more consumers of surplus or fewer consumers of famine, etc. For over 4,000 years now, female reproduction has not been an autonomous function of women, but an auxiliary function of patriarchal systems. And for the same time, period worker production has functioned as a part of the same patriarchal hierarchic wealth-producing machinery. Both female reproduction and worker production being rationalized and reified by God, religious dogmas of priesthoods and theologians, as subsidiary and inferior functions of that wealth-producing system. They are subsidiary and inferior functions in the sense that they are disempowered, many controlled by the system to the benefit of the empowered few. As far as the wealth production or actual value goes, female and workers are not, or of course not subsidiary or inferior in any way, but primary producers of all wealth. In both cases, worker production and female reproduction, wealth is produced for the dominant males or dominating male system with its auxiliary wives by organizing what was once organically rooted in sexual spiritual activity into coerced mechanical reproductive activity. The cyclic dance of impassioned bodies is forcibly and moralistically restructured, the chain gang of numbered bodies forming an assembly line or a maternity ward. Human biological dream energies, once numerous ends in themselves, are co-opted and rechanneled into profit-making results via a collision of religious and governmental political ideologies that manipulate the body and spirit of humanity away from the conditions or experiences of evolutionary, revolutionary ecstasy and into conditions and experiences of counter-evolutionary, revolutionary, productive repression. Both worker production and female reproduction are controlled and directed by the same forces. Sexual, spiritual, ideological systems of piety and drudgery, which are themselves teleological machines producing just enough energy to rationalize themselves automatically while maintaining themselves in power. Piety and drudgery reinforce each other by dogmatically, physically, and habitually repressing energy to a mere subsistence level, a subsistence level that is capable of only piety and drudgery. It's incapable of revolutionary ecstasy or creativity necessary to escape the subsistence level system. And piety and drudgery is the normative state of being in which female workers have been kept under patriarchy for at least 4,000 years. And finally, this condition is the result of the Bronze Age patriarchal redefinition of the female body from organic autonomous creator to male-controlled breeding machine. Technological or systematic ideological control of human labor could not exist if control of female reproductive labor did not pre-exist. For control of organic autonomous female reproduction is structurally necessary to create the mechanical state of piety and drudgery out of the repressed sexual spiritual energies. All machines, including all mechanizations, need fuel, and all fuel is originally organic energy. The energies of the organic sexual ecstasy and spiritual epiphany. Working labor can only be controlled and exploited in a situation where female reproductive labor is equally controlled and exploited, because both exploitations are necessary to keep the exploitative machinery running. And female reproductive labor, chronologically and ontologically, is the first labor. Under the world capitalizing patriarchy, the uterus is a factory, and the factory is a uterus. And the enormous profits produced by their joint biologic mechanical activities do not belong to the laborers, needless to say. They cannot take over their own productive reproductive systems. They are kept too busy and too tired, functioning at the subsistence level of mechanical piety and drudgery. In terms of evolutionary biology and of yoga, one could say that the large masses of people are being forcibly retained and maintained at the level of the reptile brain, the brain of ritualized repetition and benumbed violence. Kundalini is not allowed, by primarily moral restrictions, to rise up and illuminate the situation. Indeed, the reptile brain is kept strangely hypnotized from the outside by mass-produced dreams and commercial hallucination of transcendence. The luminosity is on the entertainment screen, while the evolutionary brain sits in darkness. But what does this all mean in relation to today's world and the three interlinked phenomena previously mentioned? First, everywhere in the world, governments are desperately trying to control and channel their populations to meet the economic pressures being put on them by the spread of the global corporate developmental enterprise, especially the strain of domestic economies being deformed and de-energized by the enormous drain of military budgets. Pages of statistics exist to illustrate this phenomena, but what it really means is the billions of female wombs and ovaries being directly manipulated by their governments, and rarely in the interests of the women involved. Government heads are seeking to increase or decrease populations in the interest of their own political careers and to meet the demands of the global corporate investors. As we've seen, a corporation like Mattel colludes with the Philippine government to promote sterilization among Filipino women workers, and this ensures that the corporations consider to be more malleable and less demanding labor force in the free trade zone, and it also puts numerical brakes on an increasingly revolutionary Filipino population. In Sri Lanka, Ceylon, the government also wants to reduce its population, especially amongst poor Tamil labor workers agitating for civil and economic rights. Forced sterilization occurs among female workers on the vast tea plantations. In Malaysia, on the other hand, the Prime Minister, Mahathir Mohamad, wants to increase his country's population to fill the labor shortage. He aims to swell Malaysia's population from 15 million to 70 million. And to do this, his government has launched an all-out program of maternity promotion, including the repression of feminist groups working for women's reproductive rights. In all cases, whether the plan is to increase or decrease populations, the governmental political control of women's reproduction is directly related to the control of the labor force. In particular, since women workers compose of at least 80% of the light assembly workforce in the global free trade zones, multinational corporations preferentially employ women workers because With the collusion of the host government, they can pay women workers lower wages and also be assured a docile population of workers, conditioned by generations of religious social customs to obey males in authority and to engage in long hours of repetitive, boring work without complaint. Women workers trained to piety and drudgery. On a global scale, therefore, it is no longer possible to speak of the labor force separate from women workers. And by the same token, it is no longer possible to analyze the management of labor production separately from the management of female reproduction. They are fast becoming one and the same. To control female reproduction and women's rights globally, it is necessary to control the rights of labor populations globally and vice versa. And the free trade zones are the spearheads or experimental models of this total global control, with repressions of unions and political activity, along with the forced or coerced sterilization of women workers already built into their structures. As Ana Fuentes and Barbara Ehrenreich point out in Women, the Global Factory, crudely put, the relationship between many third world governments and multinational corporations is like that of a pimp and his customers. The governments advertise their women, sell them, keep them in line for the multinational Johns. They do this with the help of funding received from the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, which approve and bankroll this global arrangement. It is an arrangement by which both the world's female population and the world's labor population are legally laid out for sexual economic use via the political and religious laws and customs of their home countries. Actual sexual coercion happens frequently in the free trade zones, as it always has happened to women on the job, with male bosses trading continued employment for sexual favors on the work tables. But the major sexual control and exploitation is and will be a total control of female reproduction by the way of the workplace, i.e. via the economic, political needs and manipulations of the multinational corporations. Indigenous male governments worldwide, to maintain themselves in funds and power, seem generally willing to loan out the bodies and lives of their female populations in this prostitutional way. And what about the male populations of these countries? Unfortunately, many of them can find employment only in the National Guards and police forces. And in these occupations, they are frequently sent to work against the women workers, to break up labor sit-downs and organizational meetings, to destroy and punish any attempt of the part of the female employees to form active unions or engage in political protest. It is the classic imperialist maneuver to dominate a people by turning a sufficient number of indigenous males into armed guard policing and terrorizing their own people, in particular the indigenous women, thus diverting sexual energy from revolution into repression. In Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, in Taiwan, in the Philippines, in South Korea, in Malaysia, National Guards and police forces have been sent by their governments to break up demonstrations, strikes, or simply meetings of female workers. In the Dominican Republic, the dominant multinational corporation, Gulf and Western, sponsors its own goon squad, an indigenous male motorcycle gang which specializes in terrorizing suspected union sympathizers. In Incheon, South Korea, women in the Dongtu Textile Company, a producer of fabrics and yarn for export to the US, had succeeded in gaining leadership in their local union in 1972. In 1978, the government-controlled, male-dominated Federation of Korean Trade Unions sent special action squads to destroy the women union. Armed with steel bars and buckets of human excrement, the goons broke into the union office, smashed the office equipment, and smeared the excrement all over the women's bodies and in their ears, eyes, and mouths. Classic labor organization strategy, long dominated by males, has been reluctant to consider the political importance of working women's issues and has been often contemptuous of the theory put forth by some socialist and Marxist women that female productive and reproductive labor is the primary producer of wealth and must be structured into any effective labor theory and practice. Classic revolutionary strategy, long dominated by males, has been equally reluctant to consider the political primacy of female issues and equally contemptuous of the idea that a revolution should be mounted on the issue of women's oppression and liberation. With the spread of the global factory and the consequent merger of women's reproductive issues with the female workers' issues among a planetary multinational controlled workforce of primary exploited women, these classic labor, left, and revolutionary political male attitudes and positions have got to change. In the present situation, if males do not join with women workers to fight for women's reproductive autonomy, along with workers' rights, then males have no other place to go except to join the National Guards, the SWAT teams, the goon squads, gearing up everywhere to help colonize and exploit their own country women as slave workers and breeding machines. These are the only two options left for political men, or in a totally politicized world, for all men. So as long as governments can control female reproduction in any way, the workforce can be equally controlled. Vice versa, it will be possible for governments and global corporations to totally control populations of workers, so long as they are able to control populations of females as breeding machines or as non-breeding machines. No one can be free unless females are free to control our own sex and our own reproduction. If we don't control our own bodies, they are controlled by the boss, and that keeps the boss in power forever. Some slaves can dominate and exploit the slavery of others, the classic imperialist situation, but no one will have a chance to be ontologically free. This is no longer the logic of feminism alone. It has to be expanded to become the inner logic of the multinational corporate marketplace, and consequently of global factory structure and operations in relation to the international workforce. Second, how does fundamentalist religion fit into all of this? Clearly, it was patriarchal pastoral religion that originally sanctified and enforced the Bronze Age designation of women as breeding machines, as cattle, yes, cattle, but for the greater glory of God. It was the male priesthoods of Father God religions who first wrote and enforced the new laws and new customs that stripped Neolithic women of all of their ancient sexual autonomy and made their sexual and reproductive functions the property of a dominating male elite for God and profit. It was the Bronze Age priesthood of Yahweh in particular who first wrote and applied moral sanctions and religious justifications for the treatment of women as ontologically inferior beings, sacred only to the extent that we have, or should have, divine male sperm growing inside of us. In the face of post-World War II, feminism and a general desire on the part of many people in the Western world to liberalize their religious ideas, and in particular to undemonize sexuality for both sexes, the modern fundamentalist priesthood has rebuted strongly, raising the banner of their Bronze Age counterparts of 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. The basic tenets of the Bronze Age priesthood being that, number one, human sex is sacred only for reproductive purposes, and two, women have nothing to say about it except yes, master. Women essentially evil is sacralized only by lifelong sacrificial submission to the male sex and to reproduction. Thus speaketh the Bronze Age holy men of the 1980s. When Curtis Anton Becerra was arrested for firebombing a feminist health center and abortion clinic in Everett, Washington in 1984, he confessed to police, "I did it for the glory of God." In 1984, 24 abortion clinics or counseling offices in 7 states were destroyed or heavily damaged by firebombers or arson. And there were 150 reported cases of vandalism and harassment. Don Benny Anderson, who is now serving 42 years in a Wisconsin prison for a clinic bombing in suburban Washington, D.C., 2 firebombings in Florida, and the kidnapping of an Illinois doctor who performed abortions, is also the man who coined the term Army of God to describe the fundamentalists with the mission to stop abortion in America. Referring to the bombing so far, he said, these are just warning blasts. We are in the embryonic stages of civil war, holy war. The holy bombers of abortion clinics are utterly sincere in their beliefs. And furthermore, they are right. Their God does call for total control by men over the sexual and reproductive functions of women, extending far beyond the forbidding of abortion, contraceptions of any kind. Contraceptions are also forbidden of any kind or for any method that might allow women to engage in non-reproductive sex for pleasure. Their God is the Bronze Age father god of cattle breeders, the biblical Yahweh, for whom Hebrew women of those days were made to be pregnant as much as possible to multiply his congregation. And this did not spare pregnant women of other neighboring faiths, however, from having their bellies ripped up by holy heroes like King Menahem before he was established on the throne of Israel by the same God. The Old Testament Yahweh was concerned with the fertility of the Hebrew tribes, while simultaneously he did not hesitate to command and sanctify the slaughter of other people's tribes, including other people's children, suckling infants, and fetuses. Pregnancy and population control, even in the Bible, was highly political. Be that as it may, the fundamentalist Protestant and Catholic anti-abortionists are following in the ways and dictates of their God. The rudimentary question remains, is their God the God? The feminist joke is, if men could get pregnant, abortion would be a sacrament. The corollary to this is, if God is seen as female, the problem does not exist. That is, the entire question of sex, pregnancy, birth control, and even abortion undergoes an ontological somersault, a revolution of basic terms. Just what God, whose God, what life, whose fertility, and who and what is defining God or life. Evolutionary biology shows that the human female, alone among all Earth's creatures, is designed for non-reproductive orgasmic pleasure. In her development of the menstrual cycle and her breakaway from the estrus or heat cycle of the mammalian world, the human female led the way for all the other advances of our species. Only human beings copulate for purposes other than species reproduction, for emotional bonding and expression, for personal pleasure, for personal confusion, personal power and glory, and personal revelation. Well, it is precisely the poor beasts who do copulate only to reproduce, while it is precisely the poor beasts who copulate only to reproduce. The fact that the human female can and does engage in non-reproductive copulation is exactly the fact that defines her and her partner as human. How could the fundamentalist fatherhood get it so wrong? when they tell us from the Bible's pages or the church's pulpits that human sex is sacred only as it tries to make babies, and that otherwise the act reduces us to the level of beasts. How could they have gotten it so mixed up backwards? When the preachers of all time denounce Eve and through her all women for our innately lascivious and devilish sexuality, how is it that they make the horrible mistake of confusing what demonizes us to what humanizes us? The answer is, number one, because the Bronze Age priesthoods were members of pastoralist tribes, and the new patriarchal ideas of God and of human intercourse derived from cattle breeding. And two, because female sexual autonomy represented the ancient Neolithic goddess religion, which these priesthoods had set out to demonize and destroy. The biblical God was indeed a jealous God, and it was precisely the goddess, her women, and the human pleasure that he was so jealous of. And it was precisely because he and the priesthood set themselves against sexual pleasure that his own people kept backsliding. The father gods and son gods who emerged triumphant through force of arms and fanaticism from the Bronze Age were concerned not with human pleasure, nor with human evolution, nor with human transcendence. They, in their ruling priesthoods, were concerned with power and with control, and the way to control human beings. The way to gain power over human biological energy and the energies of the human psyche is to dominate and control the sexual and reproductive functions of women. This is done by, number one, trying to restrict sex only to reproduction or reproductive attempts, and two, taking the control over that reproduction away from women and handing it over to men, who then piously, mechanicalistically enact sex via the female body as a service to God. The Christian religion historically and the biblical fundamentalists today, Christian, Islamic, or Jewish, must refute the evidence of evolution because they must refute the ontological primacy or rightness of the human female as she is, a sexual being. Fundamentalists must, one, deny evolution, insisting instead that human beings came fully formed from the hands of Yahweh because, two, they must deny the correctness of human sexuality the way it is. Instead, they must insist it results from the fall and through the sin of Eve. And this explains why human beings are so sexual and so corrupt. Through this anti-evolutionary device, the Bronze Age priesthood, and thus their pure God, an asexual, anti-sexual, non-biological God, against the sexual goddess who represents the ontological emergence of human beings from and through billions of years of evolution into a conscious and spiritual sexual mode unique to us and thoroughly proper for us. Thus, the terrible irony that for centuries of human existence, in the name of distinguishing the human spirit from that of the lowly beasts, the fundamentalist priesthood has stupidly and brutally tried to restrict human sexuality activity precisely to that of beasts. It is ironic, or is it ironic, or has it been intentional? Sexual restriction and control, the promulgation and enforcement of sexual moral codes based on paranoia has been the machinery by which the priesthoods have kept themselves in power, have maintained their control over human beings. Patriarchal religious power over the human mind and the human spirit has been achieved via the genitals. This is how the machinery of control and power works. The ontological coupling of female and male was broken apart, and the organic sexual energy thus released and turned into the mechanistic energy of sexual hostility. This atom splitting was done by a male priesthood who defined women and sex as evil and dangerous, and then gave a moral control over this evil situation to man, who is thereby rendered ontologically alien to himself, to women, and to the entire natural world. Because from that moment on, he owed his life and his pleasure, something he was supposed to ever after to see as evil, corrupt, and hostile to his soul. Something like an animal or a plot of land, he was supposed to both use and restrict as a God-appointed exploiter and policeman. It was the classic imperialist device, activated in the Bronze Age by power-seeking male priesthood: divide and conquer. Divide the spiritual man from the ontological woman and enroll him as her policeman, her exploiter, her colonizer in the army of God and for the profit of God and man. The totally colonized man, colonized by priestly ideology, is thus appeased by giving him the female to colonize, and his potentially revolutionary energy is thus turned into repressive hostility against woman, against his other half, his mate, his mother, his holistic self. And this is how the divine homosexual family of the patriarchal priesthoods maintains its power, an enormous and seemingly endless power. The wreckage it has produced is all around us today, the results of generations of male hostility to the female, still maintained, still manipulated and orchestrated, holy man of all patriarchal systems. Reproduction-oriented sex, prohibition of birth control, the demonization of female sexual pleasure and autonomy, the inclusion of lifelong guilt and perpetual fear surrounding the act and the fact of sex itself. We know all this has to be done. This has done nothing to improve the relationship of woman and man, or of woman and woman, or man and man. On the contrary, it has, in William Reich's accurate perception, created a bitterly deformed and depraved, repressed machinery, which functions as the mechanical, pathological energy source for all of our larger human conflicts. They are larger only in the sense that they are the magnification of each woman's and each man's sexual ontological pain and rage into global proportions. Perpetual seething rage and continuous violence, a world always at war, and the inevitable result when men are told over and over from the beginning of their consciousness that the very source of their being is evil. This is certainly a source of so much male aggression, while women must be evil, embody it within, and this is certainly a source of much female depression. For male and female life roles in patriarchal culture are structured on the belief of this ontological evil and its embodiment in our sexual selves. In the bedroom, in the home, in the neighborhood, in the city, in the nation, in the world, all human relationships have been in some way warped and devastated by the predictable mutual hostility, grinding antagonism, fear and guilt, vicious resentment, and retribution between the sexes that must result when human beings are told that wants them to behave in their beds like breeding cattle. The lingering sour and stiff lineaments of ungratified desire that must result when both sexes are yoked together in a grim beast of burden union called sanctified marriage, functioning as a pious, non-aesthetic cattle to reproduce herd congregations for God and the Holy Church. Except the true beasts are innocent. They do not know what they do, nor what they're deprived of, nor that they suffer from this deprivation. Equally inevitable in such a world are periodic eruptions into what Pope John II calls our present day hedonism, a sexual compulsiveness that occurs also automatically in reaction to this anti-sexual compulsiveness so characteristic of the patriarchal culture. The Vatican sees the rise in abortion or in women's demands for abortion as a sign of Western hedonism and material self-indulgence, a wallowing in fleshly existence and a forgetting of the spirit. More abortions occur today, certainly, because abortions have been made legal, partially legal, or safer. Does this not necessarily mean the demand or need for abortions has actually increased? No, they've just become more visible. Some non-fundamentalist Christians are opposed to abortion primarily because they see that other preventative birth control measures are available and do not like to see surgical abortion used as a substitute for responsible birth control. No one does. But surely these thoughtful people must also understand that generation after generation of women raised in patriarchal cultures that have kept us systematically ignorant of our own sexual and productive processes leaves its deep mark. Through Christendom, the ancient herbal contraceptives, the pagan body knowledge, the folklore and customs of non-reproductive sex, once passed on from mother to daughter, were destroyed with the holy rites or driven so far underground, few Western women ever again had access to them. With all our clinical, technical knowledge of female sex and reproduction today, most teenage pregnancies occur among girls who never knew, were never taught how their bodies work or how to engage in sex without becoming pregnant. They do not know because their parents, their churches, their cultures still assume that ignorance equals prevention and knowledge equals sin. And this despite the overwhelming statistics to the contrary. But the Vatican's position and the fundamentalist patriarchal position generally is opposed to all birth control, to preventative, mechanical, and chemical contraception, as well as abortion. And this opposition to Catholic Church and the fundamentalist sects reveal their desire to control human sexuality by dogmatically limiting its occurrence to potential reproductive acts only, and anything else being sin, i.e., not dominated by fear, guilt, or the actual consequence of pregnancy. In his continued insistence that non-reproductive sex is hedonistic and that legal abortion or contraception of any kind will only encourage and increase this hedonism, the Pope is repeating the celibate clergy's long-indulged myopic illusion that only single women need abortion or birth control, i.e., that the demand for contraception and abortion is being made only by a lot of loose, lascivious single women seeking to enjoy sex outside of marriage. It is myopic illusion. Is it myopic illusion or is it intentional distortion? Surely the priesthood must know something of the 1,000-year history of married women within its own church. Surely the Vatican must know that throughout Christian, including Catholic history, women have always had abortions or have tried every bizarre means thinkable to prevent pregnancies or to end them. But of course, they frequently risk death in doing so, or the contraception or abortion failed and they died in childbirth, or they survived childbirth and watched their children starve to death, or they saw their children grow to youth and then die as cannon fodder, or rape victims, or breeders for the ruling and collusive church-state wars, or they died altogether of mass plagues exacerbated by the church's prohibitions on basic hygienic knowledge and witch medicine, or Surely the church knows the common history and enormous numbers of women forced to live as breed cows under the pious folds of its male skirts, or how to avoid pregnancy at all costs. They refused sex and they were beaten into submission or death by their husbands with the church's blessing. We search for the Vatican's long history and find nowhere any faint expression of shock or outrage over this thousand-year long saga of human wretchedness and abuse within the sacrament of Christian marriage. And we're forced to conclude, for one thing, that it is not contraception or abortion per se that the church opposes. When the Vatican and all fundamentalist priesthoods oppose what all the Vatican and all fundamentalist priesthoods oppose is sex without punishment for women. Pregnancy is considered a divinely sufficient punishment for sex. Contraception and abortion are opposed because they allow a woman to escape punishment, to have sex and go scot-free. But in the old days, at least, the days of the witch hunting and ignorance, contraception and especially abortion could be dangerous and life-threatening. If a woman sought abortion and died, well then, she was sufficiently punished too. Pregnancy or lethal abortion, it didn't matter, just so that the woman was sufficiently punished for her sex. The problem today, and the reason the Pope is bemoaning mass hedonism, is that birth control, and in particular modern abortion, have been made relatively safe. It is possible for a woman to have sex and go free, relatively. It is possible for a woman to consider the possibility of enjoying sexual pleasure without facing punishment. And that is what happens. Women become women again. Men might even become men again. We might all become our whole selves. And lo, the patriarchal priesthood faces loss of employment and loss of control, for its hierarchic power over human sexuality has always been in inverse proportion to the powerlessness of women and men over all of our sexual lives. This is to say that there is really no other choice. Either we live with sexual autonomy or we live under sexual fascism. Sexual fascism is a condition in which our sexual energy is sublimated for us by the automatic machinery of piety and drudgery. A machinery set in motion by the ruling elite to co-opt human biological energy, to use it to run its palaces, its mansions, its gorgeous religious mausoleums, and to provide it with diversionary luxuries and wars, while a large revolutionary mass of exploited people is kept in a manipulatable condition of productive repression. The machinery of sexual fascism has been running all over the world for 3,000 or 4,000 years. And for just as long, the patriarchal priesthoods have been oiling and blessing its terrible gears. They turn at their most hideous under the love beds of every woman and man on earth until female sexual autonomy is achieved. They will continue to turn even in the most liberated atmospheres inside the hearts, the brains, and the genitals of all of us. No one escapes unless everyone becomes free. And that is how the machinery works. In today's world, thousands of children starve to death every day. Millions more suffer the kind of malnutrition that permanently damages the brain and the body. The priests of the world's patriarchal religions, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, do not consider this situation particularly moral, but they do not consider it abnormal either. The poor are always with us. Life is hell, etc. The situation just seems to illustrate these priesthoods' biophobic case. In their ontological world hatred and doctrinal nihilism, the holy men try to persuade us, and no doubt themselves, that suffering is the eternal and definitive human condition. And the daily starvation of children is just one more sad but inescapable example of our moral condition of fleshly sin and corruption, of samsara, the sorrow and impurity of the world, or life on the wheel of the Buddhistic illusion. Male priesthoods of patriarchal religions, all of whom live in the maximum comfort and even luxury their cultures can afford, have been rationalizing the suffering of others for so long, throughout 4,000 years of droning, no doubt, they've become to believe their own words for want of hearing anything else. 1 million infants die each year of starvation and malnutrition in India. This is considered life by Hindu holy men who preach that all life is just an illusion anyway. But if this year 1 million holy men died of starvation in India, you may be sure we would hear something about it beyond the usual samsaric drone. 1 million starved babies a year does not make headlines. 1 million starved holy men probably would. But of course, eternal suffering is not the lot of the world's holy men, and never or rarely has been. Eternal suffering is rather their property, their thing, their device, as it were, which allows them to retrain employment as representatives of an all-powerful male god who just doesn't or somehow seem able to help solve any of these problems. The priests blame the problems on life, on humanity, and they thus handily explain all the injustice and imbalance while maintaining themselves in the comfort as beneficiaries. As holy men for whom life's eternal suffering is a profitable possession, they don't like blasphemous interference or challenge, especially from women. In the world of patriarchal piety, the only women who are rewarded or loved or sainted are women like Mother Teresa, who succor the problem. Women who move to solve the problem are hated and cursed, or worse. For example, in 1984, Kuwaiti feminist Dr. Noura Al-Falah, a sociologist at Kuwait University, was fired from her job and imprisoned for the crime of lecturing on women under patriarchal religion. She analyzed and encouraged her students to analyze the positions of women in Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and Greek philosophy. For this, she was charged by her government with questioning the existence of God and anti-Islamic activity. This is one of those governments beloved by the fundamentalists in which God is at its center. Dr. Al-Falah is now awaiting execution for her crimes. The truth is, this much world suffering and starvation and degradation and brutality and poverty is neither normal, nor natural, nor ontologically given. No normal living human female in a normal life situation keeps having children year after year just to watch half of them die before the age of 12. Women normally, and for the most of human life on Earth, give birth to one child at a time. And this is what distinguishes Homo sapiens from most mammals, except for the higher primates. And with this intense and exclusive maternal care, including nursing for 3 to 6 years, the mother concentrates on raising that one child to a healthy level of independent development before she has another baby. Among all primitive primal people, this is the normal practice. Even primates nurse one baby for 3 to 6 years before becoming pregnant again, even apes. No chimpanzee or gorilla mother is forced into bearing one baby a year after year. It just isn't done. Nor is it done anywhere where human females have healthy control over their own reproduction. The problem of mass poverty, mass starvation, and the mass deaths of children and infants every year from a simple lack of proper nourishment is not normal. It's not life, nor is it the fault of human sin or sex or of women. It is a condition traceable solely and specifically to patriarchal religion and patriarchal religion's 4,000 years of fascist control over female reproduction. The problem cannot be solved, will not be solved, short of mass annihilation until and unless women regain complete sexual autonomy. And this means that priests and holy men must give up their unwholesome urges to possess and to explain human suffering rather than to end it. They must also give up their nasty and peculiar urges to control and manipulate human genitalia and reproductive organs as holy men rather than as lovers. And this too, in a normal world, just is not done. The anti-abortion movement in the US calls itself pro-life. In fact, it is pro-fetus, period. Championing a fetus is easy. The mother's body is doing all the work. What is hard to change the world so that millions and millions of children have a chance for some kind of qualitative life after they are born. And this is the only genuine pro-life work. If the anti-abortion movement presented a consistent pro-life gestalt in the world, in the whole range of their political and religious beliefs, then they would be presenting an ethical position worthy of respect, if not agreement. But this is not the case. The overwhelming majority of white Christian American pro-lifers display consistently biophobic voting records, hawkish on war, supportive of every Pentagon budget, supportive of nuclear proliferation, pro-cruise in Europe. They are marked by a flag-waving, Bible-toting, political religious hostility to any idea of peaceful coexistence with the USSR, with Cuba, with Nicaragua, and they tend to oppose negotiation for life with any government they consider demonic, i.e. leftish. But one cannot be pro-holy war and pro-life both. The terms cancel each other out, especially in a nuclear world. In domestic areas, the anti-abortionists are consistently and militantly opposed to all social welfare programs that allow children after birth to receive decent nutrition, medical care, shelter and education, or even a dream of social and economic equity when they grow up. Most anti-abortionists, led by Ronald Reagan, are even on record in opposition to programs like WIC, which try to provide minimal nutritional and medical care for poor pregnant women. In February of 1985, the Physicians' Task Force on Hunger in America announced that hunger, chronic malnutrition, malnourishment, and undernourishment has reached epic proportions in America, but that most visible anti-abortionists align themselves on the side of a president, an administration, and a mindset that has publicly stated that allegations of rampant hunger simply cannot be documented, and which has pointed to the existence of very tall Black basketball players and fat welfare mothers, i.e. women who live on cheap starch and lard, as evidence that no one is badly fed in America. In 1983 in Detroit, Michigan, with depression-level unemployment in the automobile factories, combined with massive state and federal cutbacks in the food and medical assistance programs, the Public Health Department announced that infant mortality rates in some sections of the city had reached levels comparable to the infant death rate in Honduras. Furthermore, there has been an epidemic rise in childhood cancer. Once rare, now it is the second major cause of death amongst children, with 6,000 new cases reported each year in America, and the rise is attributable primarily to chemical pollution of the environment. But all government funding for research into children's vulnerability to environmental contamination, research that was begun under the Carter administration, was cut off totally by the Reagan administration. The most visible politicians involved in the anti-abortion movement have, in their voting records, supported all such budget cuts. Are the pro-lifers out ranting and rallying to get cuts restored? No. This is not to say that abortion is the answer to all of our problems of malnutrition, malregulation of industry, and maldistribution of wealth and resources. The argument is simply that to be righteously supportive of a fetus's full term within the womb and then to entirely abandon it after it's born is ludicrous. When one reads the total gestalt of the anti-abortionist movement in America, it's clear to see that the average pro-lifer is not pro-life at all. Certainly not pro-quality of life. Rather, they are pro-control. Their obsession is the old Bronze Age fundamentalist patriarchal obsession to control female sex and reproduction. Pro-life men in particular, like those who firebomb abortion clinics for the glory of God, reveal their pastoralist belief that human life derives from divine male sperm and that the human female is simply a vessel containing this life for God. In her research into the motivations of pro-life women, Faye Ginsburg, in her essay, The Body Politic, The Defense of Sexual Restriction by Anti-Abortionist Activists, found a more sophisticated and secular complex of reasons. Anti-abortion women activists tend to feel that abortion rights are a key part of a whole feminist agenda that threatens their vocation as housewives and mothers. In a patriarchal culture that gives women few chances for employment in interesting careers or just well-paid jobs, the vocation of white middle-class housewife is definitely an attractive occupation. Most of us, if we're honest, and have experienced a lot of the alternatives, can sympathize with these women's desire to hold on to their domestic roles and to the mystique of these roles. But it must be pointed out that the motivation has nothing to do with the fetus or with the problems of poor women, single mothers, or working women. It is a motivation of understandable but limited self-interest. Further, it compounds the incorrect perception that motherhood and marriage are always synonymous, and that the abortion problem would be resolved if all of these single, loose, and lascivious women would just stop having sex or get married. The problem is not, nor has it ever been this simple. Finally, no matter how deeply devoted anti-abortion women activists might be to their homes and their domestic well-being, they have never, as a group, been able to wrest enough political power away from their right-wing husbands to ensure, via adequate, compassionate funding, the healthy and happy home life, nourishment, healthcare, education, and general well-being of all of those other women's fetuses after they are born. The concern for the fetus alone is blind, if not hypocritical, if not a hypocritical sentiment, easy to indulge in because it requires nothing. It demands nothing of the person indulging in such a sentiment. The concern for the entire human life following the birth is a genuine human passion because it requires everything. It demands everything from us. Pro-life must mean more than just an obsession with fetuses rolling down an assembly line of passive maternal flesh. It must mean a commitment to changing the world so that every child who enters a place worth living in, i.e., It means that every righteous anti-abortionist on earth must put his or her money, time, and thought into where his or her mouth is currently working all alone. In the words of Southwest poet Will Inman, where are all those who call abortion murder? Where do they hide the milk? Where do they spend their money? What do they plant in their mouths of their young? Perhaps the hardest part of the abortion issue for women, as well as men to deal with, is the point that it's never raised or discussed thoroughly. A woman's right to make life and death decisions. Certainly, we live in a world in which relative handful of ruling military, business, and political people wield life and death decision-making power over all of us, over the entire Certainly, we live in a world in which a relative handful of ruling military, business, and political people wield life and death decision-making power over all of us and over the entire continuing life on Earth all of the time. They have allocated to themselves such awesome power and without our permission. At any moment, they can make the decision to obliterate us with nuclear missiles, sicken and destroy us with various kinds of chemical and nerve gases, drag us off to concentration camps or torture chambers. Yes, even in America, force us or our children into armies, send our sons and perhaps our daughters off to death or mutilation in any number of dubiously necessary world conflicts. And certainly we don't like this situation, but we live with it every day. Under 4,000 years of patriarchal conditioning, we have come to accept it as normal or given that any number of selected groups of men should hold absolute life and death power over our lives and over our children's lives, at least in certain designated situations, the situations defined and designated by men. We have also given power to a larger number of people than we care to think about, to make decisions affecting the issues of diminished life and slow death for many, many people, including ourselves. These are issues of environmental pollution, industrial safety, chemicals in our food, the whole universe of imperfectly tested medicines and drugs. At this moment, someone somewhere can be making a decision about putting something into the air, the water, the food chain, the school building, the automobile upholstery. And that somewhere down the line, 20 years from now, will kill us or kill a child or something else that we value and love. We all know such decisions are being made every day by decent and anonymous people. We prefer not to think about it, but this does not stop the decisions from being made. For women, the issue of life and death decision-making power is in someone else's hands, is even more strange. Everywhere women go into this world, the male sex holds power of life and death over us. Men can beat us, rape us, cage us in their loony bins and torture labs, force us into demeaning and life-endangering labor, sweatshop labor, factory work, street prostitution, childbearing or illegal abortion, in exchange for our daily bread or the lives of our living children. The life and death power of the male sex over the female sex has become such a substructure of every moment, act, and fact of our lives, it has become to seem normal to many people. Are men gods? No. But they have, over 4 millennia of male domination, allocated themselves such godlike powers over us. Men rarely question their right to wield these powers. They believe it does come from God, their version of God. In fact, the exclusive male right to decide over life and death defines patriarchal power. The army of God, anti-abortionist men, who waved the Bibles in the faces of pregnant women going into clinics to have abortions. The fundamentalist men who talk so much about God's law in regard to female reproductive choices are the same men who would agree absolutely with the absolute power given to biblical patriarchs by God over the lives of their family. The kind of divinely mandated power that gave Hebrew fathers the right to stone their daughters to death if they were suspected of being non-virgins before marriage. The daughter's mother had no say in the matter. She just had to stand by and watch her daughter being stoned to death for the great crime of having a non-intact hymen, perhaps, a condition occurring, doctors tell us, in about 50% of the female population by mere accident. The God-fearing men who are so concerned with the fetus might happen to believe in a God who gave fathers the right to kill their living children at any time if they were considered disobedient or corrupt. Is this the same God who forbids a woman to abort a fetus? Yes, it is. Because the biblical God and the fundamentalist men who wave his holy book under the noses of pro-abortion women are not involved in a religion of life, but in a religion of male control. Fundamental to this religion and this control is a male's exclusive right to make life and death decisions. Abortion represents women's right to make such decisions. And the fundamentalist men cannot bear the thought of sharing such ontological power with women. They oppose abortions not because they care mightily about the fetus. By their historic record, they show that they never have. But they do care mightily about retaining this exclusive male power over life and death. For it is this power which keeps them in power. And it must be pointed out that under historic patriarchy, women's non-possession of such ontological life and death decision-making power has nothing to counteract men's possession and use of such power, i.e., our harmlessness has not kept him from doing harm. On the historical scale of the past 4,000 bloody years, our meekness has not influenced him to be meek, but has often, on the contrary, provoked him to a greater violence. It is that revenge against feminine hermeticism, that masculine desperate attempt to obtain response from a body we feel is insensible, that Octavio Paz speaks of, that religious female humility and non-action against which macho sadism seems compelled to beat its fists. But it is not only the men that are terrified by the possibility of women regaining our ontological life and death deciding powers. Women fear it intensely, and for good reason. But this is one of the most important parts of the book, I would say. But it is not only men who are terrified by the possibility of women ontological life and death deciding powers. Women fear it intensely, and for good reason. Ontological power equals ontological responsibility. A woman that is totally conscious that she is making a life and death decision for which she alone is cosmically answerable. Such a woman can never be a little girl again. Never again daddy's little girl or God's sweet angel or all the rest of the situational epithets designed to inculcate in females a chronic state of cosmic non-responsibility, i.e. of personal non-attention to or avoidance of the universal life and death resonance and holistic repercussions of the effects of her choices, i.e. she can never be a non-thinking human being again. And this is what the world needs from women. A lot of hard ontological life and death thinking that is neither distracted nor discouraged nor beaten down by 4,000 years worth of male God sermonizing about what life is, what God is, what woman is, what man is, and what it's all supposed to be about in this programmed, prefabricated, prearranged, and preposterous patriarchal chapter and verse propaganda script, which everyone has followed for too long as holy writ. As Paul Virilio points out in The Pure War, women have been patted on the head and patronizingly absolved to life and death thinking for generations. The big man, the father, the husband, the priest, the boss, the king, the president, the military leader takes heavy, bloody, scary life death cerebration out of our hands and says, "Here, darling, let me do that for you." And now, at least, at the possible end, that is, of humanity, we can see where that leads. If it is not too late for all of us, all women on a global scale, we have got to regain our ancient ontological power, an intuitive skill for making life and death decisions. For they are always linked. Life and death are linked. To decide at the root about life, about what life is and could be, women must also know how to decide at the root about death, about what death is for, what death means to life. Millions of women worldwide thrown into life and death situations of warfare, torture, mass rape, political slavery, and all the rest. Millions of third world women and minority women in the United States also, Black, Chicano, Native American, Asian, have grown up being forced to make and live with heavy ontological life and death decisions. This is what the more sheltered average American white woman perceives as their strengths. It is strength and often bitterly won authority of being utterly alone and responsible at the very root of things, life and death. Also always twinning around each other like poisonous snakes who are also lovers. All women, and maybe the highly sheltered average American white women, most of all, must begin the daily practice of wrestling with these twined serpents. For that is how the ontological muscles are developed. That is how the sexual and spiritual powers are intertwined. This is how females regain evolutionary memory and habit of being cosmic women once again, i.e., that is how God becomes female. As women cease being passive vessels of the divine male sperm, we cease being passive vessels of male ideology, including the patriarchal priesthood's image of God. And this is probably the ultimate challenge to the Christian church and to all of the patriarchal religions which depend for their existence on the passive receptacleness of women as handmaidens to male activity, as mothers who are relied on to inculcate the received male God image into their children's brains and nervous systems, as fertile proliferators of crowded and repressed or rich and repressive congregations. This is the real challenge presented by feminist issues, including abortion rights, to fundamentalist religions, and to the liberal ones as well. Female sexual autonomy equals female mental autonomy, and both together add up to female spiritual autonomy. When women begin to define their own lives, including being ontologically responsible for each life we choose to bring or not bring into the world, then women will become fully functioning definers of the world. And then we will be fully responsible for the kind of world, the spiritual and physical quality of the world into which we bring new life. And this is undoubtedly the root of fear of patriarchal religions and their priesthoods and devoted followers. That someday half the world's population will get up off its knees, throw down the mops and the prayer beads, and the whole dreary catechism of subliminally mumbled words, and just walk out of the house of God for good, leaving no one to mop the floor. and walking out into the larger world that is so inherently spiritual in its own right, just as it is, evolutionarily perceived by the eyes clear at last. It will need no priests or no preachers or prefabricated holy scripts to define or explain itself to us. The world and its life will then be self-evident, just as entire living universe is self-evident. How could it be otherwise to itself? And if we are all here, we are here as organic parts of itself. And the man and the woman will be as gods. As gods are grains of sand tumbled in the night sea, or dust balls rolling over the church floor. And the patriarchal priesthoods will be left alone with this to mop up their own floors. The third point is the women must do this very soon, or we might never again, or never for a long time, be free to do it. Free, that is, in the sense of being autonomous and whole. Advances in reproductive technology and the worldwide spread of technological control over female reproduction as a function of political and corporate power over worker populations threatens all women with global exploitation as state or business controlled breeding machines. This means having our eggs, our uteruses, our hormonal systems engineered and used, not in our own interests, but as functions of the global assembly line and mass produces human beings to order, along with everything else. This is not a brave new world fantasy. The basic technology exists, is in use, and is being refined and elaborated every day. Every time a third world woman is coerced into surgical sterilization, every time fertility control drugs are considered too dangerous for Western women, are too dangerous for Western women to use, or dumped and pushed on populations of third world women. Every time an American egg mother has her eggs fertilized in vitro and reinserted into her womb, or her fertilized eggs transplanted into the womb of another woman, every time lightweight Y-bearing sperm is collected in a test tube and allowed to dive quickly to the bottom, while the heavier X-bearing sperm remains floating on top, thus separating the father's male and female sex chromosomes and consequently allowing the couple to choose to have the woman impregnated with the male child. Each incident constitutes experimental research and is part of a vaster research and experimental program aimed at complete technological control over human reproduction. Scientists might deny this or call it an exaggeration, but history shows us that scientists rarely know what they're doing. They always express ingenuous surprise when they finally figure out what uses business, politics, and the military have put their innocent little laboratory discoveries. Further, Western scientists are themselves thoroughly enmeshed in the gears of the machinery of control, which they have helped to invent. They are, in fact, employed by it. And they are not funded so generously by governments to be renegades or even wise people. Many thoughtful members of minority populations in the United States and the West in general, Black, Native American, Chicano, and Asian people, strongly oppose abortion and sterilization and are very suspicious of all birth control projects because they see correctly that personal birth control can easily become a political tool of population control aimed at them by dominating white governments. Population control can effectively equal time capsule genocide. Throughout Africa, India, Asia, and other parts of the third world, Western technological humanists promote birth control and sterilization as a key facet of industrial economic developmental programs. Their operating premise or pretense is that problems of famine, poverty, disease, lack of education, and economic development, etc., are all blamable on overpopulation and those savages that just breed like flies. This neatly absolves their own Western imperialistic cultures and the whole machinery of political, economic, and religious colonization from all responsibility in the creation and maintenance of these problems. Most third world women are fully aware that fertility control and sterilization programs urged or forced on them as part of the Western economic and industrial designed development programs are just a contemporary phase of the same old ongoing colonialization and control imperialism. It is the habit of Western white women to think of such problems as happening elsewhere. But with the spread of the global factory system and the consequent outsourcing of so many American jobs and industries to the low wage countries of the third world, with the malignant overdevelopment of military economies and the expense of domestic economies, and the consequent non-development or de-development of Western societies to the point that Paul Virilio calls endocolonialism, i.e. Western nations will themselves become functional colonies of their own governmental, business, and military establishments, now grown to politically uncontrollable global populations, and with the necessity of conducting the most elaborate and refined reproductive technology and genetic engineering experiments, initially at least relatively affluent white Western couples or single women who can afford them, there will soon be no elsewhere. Further, some Western women have even welcomed the envisioned cooperation of their female biological functions by advanced reproductive technologies. Feminists such as Shulamith Firestone have expressed the idea that women will not be free until babies are grown entirely in test tubes, until the complete female reproductive process is taken over by medical technology. Other women believe just the opposite, that historically the increasing process of male control over reproduction has equaled male control over the female sex, one way or the other, and even further into sci-fi horror, once patriarchally oriented men are able to technologically, mechanically reproduce themselves, women will rapidly achieve the status of a dispensable population. These men will also be able to reproduce their own ideal sexual servo mechanisms. Both sides of this debate get lurid because the situation calls for it. Do we become free by having machines and biotechnology take over all of our physical functions? i.e., is it freedom? Is freedom a technological state? Or is it the ontological state achievable only when a biological, spiritual, conscious organism is able to experience autonomy of all of its functions rather than substitution of its functions? Many contemporary Western women can sense what's going on here by considering the whole movement of pregnant women in the past 2 decades away from medical control of their pregnancies and childbirths, the reappearance of midwives, the use of herbal medications and massage and other benign techniques to ease labor, home births in low-lit, cozy atmospheres without the intrusion of forceps, stirrup position, delivery room professionalism, and glare. Women have been reacquainted with some of our own basic sexual bodies. And the experience has brought a sense of both calm and empowerment. And we find that for the most parts, our bodies know what they're doing and how to do it. Most of the time, we can trust them to perform pretty well, if not absolutely brilliantly, when it comes to having babies. We now find that women are doing it rather than asking doctors to do it for us. Isn't it interesting that now, of all times, the business of reproductive technology blooms? Genetic screening, counseling, and engineering, fetal monitoring during labor, surrogate motherhood, and all the rest, all designed to get pregnancy and the childbirth back into the hands of the experts, i.e., highly trained intellects surrounded by machinery. Designed originally perhaps for the special cases and emergency situations. This very expensive reproductive technology will rapidly become normative, just pay for itself, and the day may soon very arrive when women refuse to take advantage of such technologies. Will women who refuse to take advantage of such technologies will be considered not only backward, but bad mothers. With the mere existence of these technologies of reproductive engineering and control will come inevitably a social expectation that every child be born perfect. People who refuse the technologies and give birth to imperfect babies will be seen as morally, if not legally, guilty. And so, once more, pregnant women will be socially coerced into relying on the medical expertise of the trained reproductive technologists and will not be allowed by their societies, their mates, their own fears to trust or experience the wise organic autonomy of their own female bodies, which most of the time really do know what they're doing and how to do it. Another lurid twist of the umbilical noose looms on the horizon. It is wrapped in the American neoconservative economic theory called law and economics, developed mainly in the University of Chicago's law school under Dr. Milton Friedman and Dr. George Striegler and their followers. Law and economics proposes that all legal questions, including rape, murder, adoption, abortion, child custody, can be reduced to the economic terms of the free market system. That is, all legal and moral questions can be economically quantified and decided by the law in terms of their monetary value or cost to a society. For example, as law and economics theorist Richard Posner has argued, if a law like the exclusionary rule, which forbids courts to accept evidence illegally obtained, is decided to impose too great a private and social cost on the government, then the exclusionary rule is not economically viable and should be thrown out of the legal system. Other law and economics theorists have critiqued antitrust workers of compensation and minimum wage laws of the same basis, arguing that the cost to society of enforcing them outweighs their overall benefit. In other words, law and economics reduces legality to the market, and in doing so, reduces what we think of as personal and social morality to the dollar as well. And we're going to pause there and complete part 2 for another day.